Good day. As odd as it sounds for me to say, this is your last lecture for social stratification. And today we're going to be looking at gender inequality. And the chapter in the text begins with a series of 3 stories of gender inequality, all of them equally disturbing to my Western ears. And I'm certain they are equally disturbing for both men and women in the countries in which they occurred. Just because something is part of the law or even a cultural norm does not mean that everybody in that country agrees with it and supports it, even those who appear to benefit from the law or the norm. So don't automatically assume that all men in China or Afghanistan or Peru agree with the manner in which women are perceived and treated in their own countries. We see these reports in the media of what occurs in other countries, and they gain a great deal of worldwide attention. There's usually a certain amount of ethnocentric comment about the incident from other countries that tends to disparage the entire culture as a whole. And there's an uproar, rightly so, about the specific story. And then it all settles down again. We, in more modern countries, have generally determined that less modern countries are horrible places to be for women. The thing is, when these stories emerge and garner so much attention, it's not just the specific incident that we need to pay attention to, it's the cultural beliefs and norms that made it possible for these incidents to occur in the first place that we need to pay attention to, that indicate the status of girls and women in that country overall. Because in understanding these norms and beliefs from a non-judgmental position, we might be able to improve the life chances and daily reality of women in that country overall. For example, in 2012 in Delhi in India, there was a gang rape and murder that occurred on a public bus that gained media attention around the world. It was reported by all major news organizations when a 22-year-old female was gang raped, beaten, and tortured on a bus on which she was traveling with a male friend. Part of the assault included inserting metal rods into her, which caused extensive internal damage. 6 men, including the bus driver, assaulted her, and she later died. She had gone to see a movie with the male friend, something millions of women do around the world. Her male friend was also beaten and stripped, and he was held down during the attack, so he could not assist her at all. Afterward, the men threw the naked victims from the front door of the moving bus and tried to run them over. They then cleaned the bus with the victims' clothes before burning them and dividing what they collected among themselves, including 2 cell phones, a wristwatch, and a pair of shoes. Now, it actually didn't take the police long to find all 6 perpetrators. The bus driver was 34 and he was the oldest. He killed himself in prison at the start of his trial, although his family believes he was murdered. The youngest was 17, so he was tried separately in juvenile court and sentenced to 3 years, and he's already been released. The other 4 men were aged between 19 and 28 at the time of the attack. They were convicted and sentenced to death less than a year later, and eventually they were hanged. 3 years after the attack, in a BBC interview, the bus driver's younger brother, who is one of the perpetrators, said, and this is a direct quote, "A decent girl won't roam around at 9 o'clock at night. A girl is far more responsible for rape than a boy. Housework and housekeeping is for girls, not roaming in discos and bars at night, doing wrong things, wearing wrong clothes. About 20% of girls are good." End quote. Furthermore, he said that people had a right to teach them a lesson and that the woman should have put up with it. Quote, "When being raped, she shouldn't fight back. She should just be silent and allow the rape. Then they'd have dropped her off after doing her and only hit the boy. The death penalty will make things even more dangerous for girls. Now when they rape, they won't leave the girl like we did. They will kill her. Before her, they would rape and say, 'Leave her, she won't tell anyone.' Now when they rape, especially the criminal types, they will just kill the girl." End quote. So, as I said, this particular assault gained widespread media attention, as it should have. I'm not suggesting otherwise. And here you have two links, both to short news stories. And in the second link, you'll actually see one of the perpetrators commenting what I just said. But the fact that it even occurred in the first place, combined with how the perpetrators were defended by some in India, indicates something about the status of women in the country overall. Again, not for everyone. For weeks and weeks, there were protests in India, with thousands and thousands of people attending, demanding that these men be brought to justice and that there be a change in the laws. Both women and men attended these protests because they were outraged at what had happened in their country, and they demanded change regarding specific laws as well as how women are perceived and treated overall. Because the status of women in India overall is not very good compared to more advanced countries in several ways. In India, rape is the fourth most common crime against women in that country, just over 94% of which are committed by somebody known to the victim, not by a stranger. Sexual assault is not an infrequent occurrence. It's estimated that 1 in every 50 girls in India is forced to have her first intercourse or to participate in a sexual act when she is less than 10, according to a UNICEF report. In India, marital rape is not illegal when the woman is over the age of 18 and living with her husband. So sex within marriage is consensual by definition. In addition, violence against women in India is estimated to be much more prevalent than it first appears to be, because many go unreported based on certain cultural values and beliefs. And preferential treatment of males begins before even being born, as indicated by unbalanced sex ratios at birth, indicating selective abortion is not unusual. Aborting a fetus that is not male is common. So on one hand, India has one of the highest numbers of female politicians in the world. Yet in most families, women do not own any property in their own name and do not get a share of parental property. Families are patrilineal in nature and usually hierarchical, with elders having authority over the younger generations and men having authority over women. According to the International Men and Gender Equality Survey in 2016, 65% of Indian men believe women should tolerate violence in order to keep the family together, and that women sometimes deserve to be beaten. So when we see cases in other countries that gain a lot of media attention, such as what became known globally as the Delhi 2012 gang rape, this is often not just because of what occurred in that specific situation, but because of what is considered that country's government's lack of response to it. As I said, after the assault, for weeks, there were daily protests in India with thousands upon thousands of people attending. Thus, in this country, it seems that at all levels, individual and structural, patriarchy is the norm. The systemic dominance of men over women. Is India the only country in which this is the norm? Absolutely not. For example, there is no such thing as marital rape in Afghanistan, Algeria, Antigua, the Bahamas, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Iraq, Laos, St. Lucia, Saudi Arabia, and others. Are Western countries exempt from being labeled patriarchal in nature? Absolutely not. Western countries may have made more progress than others in this regard, but they are absolutely not immune. Now, since this is a second-year course, I'm not going to go into detail explaining the difference between sex and gender. That's something you should already have a good understanding of. What is worth reviewing is where our ideas of gender come from, and to directly quote the text, the prevailing social science position is that culture is the key to understanding most differences in male and female behavior, end quote. In our Western Canadian culture, and in the US, for example, we have very definite, widespread, and firmly entrenched ideas about gender. about how a male or female should act, about what traits should be stronger in one or the other. Our society is not as rigid as it used to be in regards to gender roles and norms, but make no mistake about it, they're still there. Breaking gender norms may not result in as immediate or as brash a consequences, but there are still often consequences. Many people, many people, and yes, it is more common in those of older generations, don't view gender norms and expectations and roles as a norm. They view them as just what is right. But that's because the norms have become so firmly entrenched in our culture that they have become, over time, viewed as simply what is right, just the way things should be. So, for example, somebody might say, why should women be primarily responsible for children? Well, because women are biologically more nurturing. It's genetic, it's the way they're made. Women are made to give birth to children, and they're wired to look after children and be nurturing and maternal in nature. Are women biologically designed to give birth? Yes. Biologically, men cannot gestate a fetus and give birth. It's a physical difference between males and females. But the belief that women are more nurturing and thus better able to nurture children and to raise them is a social construction, a cultural construction. How do we know that these gender norms are not biological in nature? That they are in fact socially and culturally constructed? Because in different societies, what is considered the natural abilities of women can be different. People in Western advanced societies like to use this reasoning in regards to countries elsewhere, when we're trying to explain that women are capable of a lot more than they are permitted to do in that country. Yes, women can drive. Women can be highly educated. Yes, women can hold political office and perform any job you can think of and do it well. So if the norms in a country say that a woman can't, that is because of that country's culture. Just look at ours. Women are doing that here. We could also use our gender norms in regard to men, applying them to men in other countries. Men can in fact be nurturing to children. It doesn't have to be all a woman's responsibility. Men don't need to be aggressive or to be violent towards women. Just look at North American culture. This proves it. Again, does this mean biology has nothing to do with gender norms? No, biology has an effect. Because again, the fact is the male and female body are constructed differently as indicated by pregnancy and childbirth. There are other differences as well. Women tend to have less natural upper body strength than men, just because of the way our bodies are created. A female's chest is not usually as broad as a male's. Of course, the most obvious physical differences are genitalia, the chest, and the fact that women have reproductive organs that allow them to produce children and then to feed them. This undoubtedly contributes to the belief that women are naturally more nurturing than men because they are biologically predisposed to that role, which is actually a perfect example of how biology and culture intersect. Because the female body is the only kind of body that can gestate a fetus and give birth to it, and because the female body is the only kind of body that can produce milk to feed that fetus, an infant had to be with its mother or a wet nurse who is a female in order to survive by breastfeeding. That physical necessity meant that women were the ones, not men, to look after young children, which is a big part of the reason why women are perceived to be naturally more nurturing than men, because they are biologically predisposed to that role. So males and females have some physical differences, although they are much more alike than dissimilar. And there are differences culturally speaking in what is expected of somebody depending on their sex. Does this have to lead to stratification between them, to inequality? Couldn't men and women just be separate but equal and then everybody's happy? In an ideal world, yeah, sure they could. And this is what, in theory, we as a society aim for. One in which everybody is perceived and treated equally, regardless of whether they are male or female. But we live in the real world, and in the real world, a hierarchy of gender exists in which women are always at least somewhat in a subordinate position in various ways. Exactly how big the difference in position is between men and women will vary depending on the society and on the point in history in that society and on the particular issue. But in every society, there is a difference. Now, this is a sociology course, and that means we need to look at what sociological theory has to say about this. Don't panic. This is not going to be a long-winded explanation, and I will not go into more detail than is necessary. I get the feeling that when students hear those words, sociological theory, that they immediately close up, kind of like a turtle retreating into its shell. But sociological theory doesn't need to be complicated. All we're doing is guessing at why society is the way it is. That's what sociological theory does. Functionalism, or structural functionalism, focuses on the purpose or the function something serves in society. Thus, functionalism views gender stratification as serving a purpose, as a functional necessity to ensure that society remains stable and survives. As already pointed out, only the female body can carry and nourish an infant. That's just the way it is. And this is why throughout history, it was the man who provided for the family with some kind of activity outside the home, and it was the woman who looked after the home, because she was tied to it due to her childbearing and child-rearing function. According to functionalism, this is functional for maintaining society stability. A very simplistic explanation in a way, but one that makes sense from a functional perspective. And I'll say I agree with this, but if you ever took intro soc with me, you know that after explaining each major sociological theory, I would comment that I agreed with it. And I would comment that I agreed with all of them. But this is how functionalism explains gender stratification in society. That it's necessary to keep society functioning well, to keep society stable. From a conflict perspective, focuses more on the allocation of power. How different groups in society all want power, and that is not possible, so conflict occurs, hence the name of the theory. Conflict theory is all about this differential access to power in society, based on access to education, economic resources, political power, etc. And yes, based on gender, with men always having more power and more access to power than women. So in simpler societies, in less developed societies, there's actually more of a balance of power between men and women, and we can still see this today in those cultures that have not had as much contact with Western civilization, and thus with technological advancement. In the last class, I briefly mentioned that in the Brazilian rainforest, that's really the only area in the world where there's some people who've not had contact with societal advancement. And in these tribes, equality is present much more because the daily work of both men and women is equally valued, because it's equally important to immediate survival. In modern societies like ours, as societies became modern, the boundary between unpaid domestic work inside the home and paid employment outside the home became more and more divisive, and the financial reward or lack thereof for each became more distinct. Men worked outside the home and brought in economic resources, over which they had control. While women's work inside the home was certainly important for the family, but that was unpaid. Thus, they did not have their own economic resources and did not have control. And as indicated in the reading, as indicated in every topic we've discussed in this course, If you don't have economic resources, you have no power. Another theory, although it's not given a specific label or title in your reading, comes back to childbearing and child rearing 100%. That gender inequality exists in society because of the fact that women are the only ones who can do both of those things. It doesn't matter how you give birth, whether it's in the hospital on your back or in water or a C-section or squatting, doesn't matter how you do it. Women are the only ones that can give birth. So even though this isn't really given a title in your text, how about we'll just make up a title and call it the reproductive theory of gender inequality? Yes, both functionalism and conflict theory would recognize this and include it as part of their explanation. But at the same time, this can also just be an explanation on its own. That contributes to gender stratification. And again, well, I just made this up, reproductive theory on gender inequality, because it's also just like its own separate point because it's such a big point. So what is the result of all this gender stratification? What does it cause? What does it produce? Well, one result is sexism, an ideology that rationalizes and stabilizes male dominance. And I was thinking, it's really not uncommon to hear people say that something is sexist. This is a term we hear pretty frequently. We hear it all the time, but I don't think it's always used in an accurate way. Because often when something is labeled sexist, or you say, that's so sexist of you, what you're really saying is it's wrong to say something or do something, but the term sexist is actually a bit more specific. When you say something is sexist, that means that it naturally infers that women are inferior to men. So it doesn't just mean something's inappropriate or politically incorrect or old-fashioned. When you call something sexist, that means whatever it is implies that women are naturally inferior to men. So sexist beliefs and ideologies and attitudes and perceptions and jokes and stereotypes, all of it can persist for generation after generation and really be difficult to reduce, much less eliminate. Sexism is at the root of sexist stereotypes, and there are a lot of them. If you look at TV and movies, for example, the stereotype of the sexy and spicy Latina woman, or the cold-hearted career woman, because a woman who is successful in her career just cannot be nurturing as well. The sassy black woman who always has a funny comeback. The crazy cat lady, because if a woman doesn't get married, that's what's going to happen to her. In Beauty and the Beast, Gaston is a walking stereotype of everything that's supposed to make a man manly. In Cinderella, she's powerless and unseen, and then Prince Charming sweeps in and rescues her and sweeps her off her feet. The whole time I was growing up on TV and in the movies, even in little kids' cartoons, the female characters always need a male character to save them. I've said to my mom more than once in jest, it's a miracle that anybody from my generation was able to do anything in terms of females. When you look at the TV and the movies we watched, the toys we played with, like Barbie. I'll give you an example I personally always think of. So even going as early as the cartoons that are produced, that kids consume, and they don't just watch them, they consume them and they affect what they think, how they think, their opinions, their perceptions, what they think is normal to expect from themselves, what they think is normal to expect from other people. Even as early as that, these contribute to gender expectations and norms and roles and stereotypes. Now, I was born in 1971, so I went through, my early childhood in the 70s. And in that time, we just did not have this huge selection of TV shows and cartoons and movies to choose from, in large part because we didn't have these specialty channels. Because of that, when I was growing up at Christmas, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer was always an absolute favorite of mine. I think a big reason I always loved Rudolph was because you had the Bumble, the abominable snowman who just looked like he was totally out of it. In this cartoon, when all the guys head out to find Rudolph and save him when he's gone off, his girlfriend Clarice and his mom are expected to just wait at home because that is what girls do. In fact, they are ordered to stay at home. So this is supposed to be Rudolph's mom and his dad with the rack on top of his head. And when she wants to go help him look for their son, he actually turns around to him and says, "No, this is man's work." Now, I still love this cartoon because I associate it so much with my childhood. And like I said, the Bumble, the abominable snowman without teeth, is my favorite. But at the same time, now I cringe a bit when it comes to that scene because as an adult, one that specifically talks about gender, I just cringe. Generally speaking, sexist stereotypes view women as more passive. As I said, naturally nurturing to a fault, and just less able to look after themselves in every way as a man does. A woman needs a man in order to be okay. Even our language supports this. An unmarried woman is an old maid, while an unmarried man is a bachelor. When a man gets gray hair, he looks distinguished. When a woman gets gray hair, she just looks old. He gets character lines, she just gets age lines. He's a player and she's a slut. Sexist stereotypes have continued to persist. They might have changed a bit, they might have been lessened, but they have persisted, even in our much more socially aware and politically correct world. Sexist stereotypes have contributed to the perception that certain differences between men and women are naturally occurring, not socially constructed. It's just the way men are, and this is just the way women are, when it's not true. Sexist stereotypes indicate women are inferior to men. These are just things that exist. They're just things that are. Sexist stereotypes are often believed, even if not believed 100%, they're still believed in part. And because they're still believed to be real, they are commonly used to justify gender stratification.